Law 4. Always say less than necessary. When you're trying to impress people with words, the more you say, the more common you appear and less in control. Even if you are saying something banal, it will seem original if you make it vague, open minded, and sphinx like. Powerful people impress and intimidate by saying less. The more you say, the more likely you are to say something foolish. Nacius Marcius, also known as Corellianus, was a military hero of ancient Rome. In the first half of the 5th century BC, he won most important battles, saving from the calamity time and time again. Because he spent most of his time on the battlefield, few Romans knew him personally, making him something of a legendary figure. In 454 BC, Corellianus decided it was time to exploit his reputation and enter politics. He stood for election to the high rank of consul. Candidates for his position traditionally made a public address in the race, and when the Corellianus came before the people, he began by displaying the dozens of scars he had accumulated over 17 years of fighting for Rome. Few in the crowd really heard the lengthy speech that followed. Those scars, proof of his valor and patriotism, moved the people to tears. Corellianus's election seemed certain. When the polling day arrived, however, Corellianus made an entry into the forum escorted by the entire Senate and by the city patrician, the aristocracy. The common people who saw this were disturbed by such blustering show of confidence on election day. And then Corellianus spoke again, mostly addressing the wealthy citizen who had accompanied him. His words were arrogant and insolent. Claiming certain victory in the vote, he boasted of his battlefield exploits, made sour jokes that appealed only to the patricians, voiced angry accusation against his opponents, and speculated on the riches he would bring to Rome. This time, the people listened. They had not realized that this legendary soldier was also a common brigand. The news of Corellianus' second speech spread quickly through Rome, and the people turned out in great numbers to make sure he was not elected. Defeated, Corellianus returned to the battlefield, bitter and vowing revenge on the common folk who had voted against him. Some weeks later, a large shipment of grain arrived in Rome. The Senate was ready to distribute this food to the people for free. But just as they were preparing to vote on the question, Corellianus appeared on the scene and took the Senate floor. The distribution, he argued, would have harmful effect on the city as a whole. The several senators appeared won over and the vote on the distribution fell into doubt. Corellianus did not stop there. He went on to condemn the concept of democracy itself. He advocated getting rid of people's representatives, the tribunes, and turning over the governing of the city of the patricians. When word of Corellianus's latest speech reached the people, their anger knew no bounds. The tribunes were sent to the Senate to demand that Corellianus appear before them. He refused. Riots broke out all over the city. The Senate, fearing the people's wrath, finally voted in favor of grain distribution. The tribunes were appeased, but the people still demanded that Corellianus speak to them and apologize. If he repented and agreed to keep his opinion to himself, he would be allowed to return to the battlefield. Corellianus did appear one last time before the people who listened to him in rapt silence. He started slowly and softly, but as the speech went on, he became more and more blunt. Yet again, he hurled insults. His tone was arrogant, his expression disdainful. The more he spoke, the angrier the people became. Finally, they shouted him down and silenced him. The tribunes conferred, condemned Corellianus to death, and ordered the magistrates to take him to once on the top of the Tarpetian or Tarpeian Tarpeian rock and throw him over. The delighted crowd seconded the decision, the patrician. However, managed to intervene, and the sentence was commuted to a lifelong banishment. When the people found out that Rome's great military hero would never return to the city, they celebrated in the streets. In fact, no one had ever seen such celebration, not even after the defeat of the foreign enemy. Interpretation. Before his entrance into politics, the name of Corellianus evoked awe. His battlefield accomplishment showed him as a man of a great bravery. Since the citizens knew little about him, all kinds of legends became attached to his name. The moment he appeared before the Roman citizens, however, and spoke his mind, all that grandeur and mystery vanished. He bragged and blustered like a common soldier. He insulted and slandered people as if he felt threatened and insecure. Suddenly, he was not at all what people had imagined. The discrepancy between the legend and the reality proved immensely disappointing to those who wanted to believe in their hero. The more Corellianus said, the less powerful he appeared. A person who cannot control his words shows that he cannot control himself and is unworthy of respect. Had Corellianus said less, the people would never have had cause to be offended by him, would never have known his true feelings. He would have maintained his powerful aura, would certainly have been elected consul, and would have been able to accomplish these anti democratic goals. But the human tongue is a beast that few can master. It strains constantly to break out of its cage, and if it is not tamed, it will run wildly and cause you grief. Power cannot accrue to those who squander their treasures of words. Observance of the law. In the court of Louis XIV, nobles and ministers would spend days and nights debating issues of state. They would confer, argue, make and break alliance, and argue again until finally the critical moment arrived. Two of them would be chosen to represent the different sides of Louis himself, who would decide what should be done after these persons were chosen. Everyone would argue some more. How would the issue be phrased? What would what would appeal to Louis? What would annoy him? At what time of day should the representatives approach him, and in what part of the Veiled Palace? What expression should they have on their faces? Finally, after all this was settled, the, fate, the fateful moment would finally arrive. The two men would approach Louis, always a delicate matter, and when they finally had his ear, they would talk about the issue of the hand spelling out the options in deal. Louis would listen in silence, a most enigmatic look on his face. Finally, when each had finished his presentation and had asked for the king's opinion, he would look at them and say, "I shall see." Then he would walk away. The ministers and the courtiers would never hear another word on this subject from the king. They would simply see the result weeks later when he would come to the decision and act. He would never bother to consult them on the matter again. Interpretation. Louis XIV was a man of very few words. His most famous remark is, "I am the state." Nothing would be more pithy, yet more eloquent. His infamous "I shall see" was one of the several extreme short phrases that he would apply to all manners of requests. Louis was not always this way. As a young man, he was known for talking at length, delighting in his own eloquence. His later taciturnity was self-imposed and act as a mask he used to keep everybody below off balance. No one ever knew where he stood or would predict his reaction. No one could try to deceive him by saying that they thought he wanted to hear because no one knew that he wanted to hear. As they talked on in the silent Louise, they revealed more and more about themselves, information he would later ish, use later them to great effect. In the end, Louis' silence kept those around him terrified and under his thumb. It was one of the foundation of his power. As Saint Simon wrote, no one knew as well as he how to sell his words, his smile, even his glances. Everything in him was valuable because he created differences, and his majesty was enhanced by the sparseness of his words. It is even more damaging for a minister to say foolish things than to them. So, power is in many ways a game of appearances, and when you say less than you're necessary, you inevitably appear greater and more powerful than you are. Your silence will make other people uncomfortable. Humans are a machine of interpretation and explanation. They have to know what you are thinking. When you carefully control what you reveal, they cannot pierce your intentions of your meaning. Your short answers on silences will put them on the defensive and they will jump in, nervously filling the silence with all the kinds of comments that will reveal the valuable information about them and their weaknesses. They will leave a meeting with your feeling as if they have been robbed, and they will go home and ponder your every word. This extra attention to your brief comments will only add to your power. Saying less than necessary is not for kings and statesmen only. In most areas of life, the less you say, the more profound and mysterious you appear. As a young man, the artist Andy Warhol had the revelation that it was generally impossible to get people to do what they wanted them to do by talking to them. They would turn against you, subvert your wishes, disobey you out of sheer perversity. He once told a friend, I learned that you actually have more power than you shut up. In his later life, Warhol employed his strategy with a great success. His interviews were exercised in oracular speech. He would say something vague and ambiguous, and the interviewer would twist in circles trying to figure out, imagining there was something profound beyond his often meaningless phrases. He claimed to have learned this tactic or technique from the masters of enigma, Marcel Duchamp, another 20th century artist who realized early on the less he said about his work, the more people talked about it, and the more they talked, the more valuable his work became. By saying less than necessary, you create the appearance of meaning and power. Also, the less you say, the less risk you run of saying something foolish, even dangerous. In 1825, a new Caesar, Nicholas I, ascended the throne of Russia. A rebellion immediately broke out, led by the liberals demanding that the country modernized, that its industries and civil structures catch up with the rest of the Europe. Brutally crushing this rebellion, the Decembrist uprising, Nicholas I sentenced one of its leaders, Kondraty Raliev, to death. On the day of the execution, Ryliev stood on the gallows, the noose around his neck. The trap door opened, but as Ryliev dangled, the rope broke, dashing him to the ground. At a time, events like this were considered a sign of providence or heavenly will, and the man saved from the execution this way was usually pardoned. As Raliev got to his feet, bruised and dirted, but believing his neck had been saved, he called out to the people, You see, in Russia they don't know how to do anything properly, but not even how to make a rope. A messenger immediately went to the Winter Palace with the news of failed hanging. Vexed by this disappointing turnabout, Nicholas I nevertheless began to sign the pardon, but then did Raliev say anything after this miracle? The Caesar asked the messenger. Sire, the messenger replied, he said that in Russia they don't even know how to make a rope. In that case, said the Caesar, let us prove the contrary, and he tore up the pardon. The next day, Raliev was hanged again. This time, the rope did not break. Learn the lesson. Once the words are out, you cannot take them back. Keep them under control. Be particularly careful with sarcasm. The momentary satisfaction you gain with your biting words will be outweighed by the price you pay. The Oracle of Delphi. When the visitors consulted the oracle, the priestess would utter a few enigmatic words that seemed full of meaning and import. No one disobeyed the words of the oracle. They held power over life and death. Authority. Never start moving your own lips and teeth before the subordinates do. The longer I keep quiet, the sooner others move their lips and teeth. As they move their lips and teeth, I can thereby understand their real intentions. If the sovereign is not my mysterious, the ministers will find opportunity to take and take. Han Fei Tzu, Chinese philosopher, 3rd century BC. Reversal. There are times when it is unwise to be silent. Silence can arouse suspicion and even insecurity, especially in your superiors. A vague or ambiguous comment can open up to interpretation you had not bargained. Silence and saying less than necessary must be practiced with caution that in the right situation. It is occasionally wiser to imitate the court jester who plays the fool but knows he is smarter than the king. He talks and entertains, and no one suspects that he is more than just a fool. Also, words can sometimes act as a kind of smoke screen for any deceptions you might practice. By bending your listener's ear with talk, you can distract and mesmerize them. The more you talk, in fact, the less suspicious of you they become. The verbose are not perceived as sly and manipulative, but as helpless and unsophisticated. This is the reverse of the silent policy employed by the powerful. By talking more and making yourself appear weaker and less intelligent than your mark, you can practice deception with greater ease.